We're going to start this story softly. Okay, I'm gonna just come right out and say it. This is the least dramatic way to open an episode ever, but we got to do it because I want you to settle in and imagine that you are walking through the forest. It's not like humid or anything. You have no pack on your back. You don't even really know where you're going. Oh, there's water nearby, but you're not thirsty. It's just kind of a nice walk. And as you saunter along, you hear some birds singing, maybe a deer skittering off into the underbrush. The trees are big and old, and you feel very small underneath them, so now that you're properly relaxed, we can crank up the drama to like a 3 out of 10. Okay, good. Now let me tell you about a journey deep into an unknown and dangerous land, a journey fraught with peril and hardship, a journey that would result in the deaths of hundreds of men and forever change the course of history. This is Chapter 1, Hernando de Soto. Welcome to the podcast where we bring you the most important stories from the past. Every single day on this channel, we share a dramatic reading from history, and here on the podcast, we explore the stories behind the stories. I am your host, and today we begin our journey into the American Southeast with a conquistador named Hernando de Soto. So you understand how this story started. We need to talk about who he was, how he got to this point in his life, and why he was doing what he was doing. So get ready for some exposition because it's time for the backstory. Hernando de Soto was a Spanish conquistador. That is to say, he was a soldier who fought for the Spanish crown in their wars of conquest. He was a veteran of the Spanish conquest of Peru, which had been completed just a few years prior to his journey into the American Southeast. He was wealthy, having acquired a significant fortune during the conquest, and he was ambitious, looking to make even more wealth and glory for himself by discovering new lands and conquering new peoples for the Spanish crown. To understand what Hernando de Soto was doing in the American Southeast, though, we need to understand what Spain was doing in general at this point in history. During the 16th century, Spain was a global empire. Its territory stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, and the Spanish were hungry for more. They wanted more gold to finance their wars in Europe and Asia. They wanted more glory to enhance the prestige of the Spanish crown, and they wanted more power to further expand their empire. The Spanish monarchy had recently reorganized its colonial administration in America. The goal was to make it easier to manage the empire and extract more wealth from its colonies. Spain divided its North American territories into 4 audiencias. An audiencia was basically a colonial court with administrative and judicial functions. Each audiencia was headed by a president who was appointed by the king, and each audiencia had jurisdiction over several provinces. In 1539, Hernando de Soto arrived in the port of Uruba, located in present-day Cuba, with orders from the Spanish crown to explore and conquer the lands within the audiencia of Nueva España. He was given a noble title, adelantado, which entitled him to a share of the wealth he discovered, as well as the right to appoint officials and collect taxes. He was also granted the title of governor, Capitan General, giving him authority over the indigenous peoples he encountered. Basically, the Spanish crown was giving Hernando de Soto a blank check. Go out there, find some gold, meet some natives, collect some tribute, find some cities, found some settlements, conquer some people, find some other conquistadors and kill them all. Just go do some stuff over there. Here's a couple buddies. We'll see you in a couple years later. Now we have our characters, we have our setting, and we have our context. All that's left is to follow Hernando de Soto on his journey into the unknown. Soto began his journey inland from Uruba with about 200 men and 1,500 troops. They traveled in 2 large groups. The first group, consisting of about 60 men, was led by Soto himself. The second group, consisting of about 140 men, was led by his friend and fellow conquistador, Francisco Hernandez de Cula. The 2 groups were to travel separately but meet up later. The first group consisted of about 60 men, including Hernando de Soto, his close friend and fellow conquistador, Francisco Hernandez de Cula, and a handful of soldiers, interpreters, priests, and civilians. These men carried with them supplies for a 2-year stay in the New World. They brought horses for riding and pack animals, cattle for meat, dogs for hunting and fighting, and firearms for defense and offense. The second group was larger, consisting of about 140 men, but it was not nearly as well supplied. These men had been promised adelantado status, and so they were essentially working for free. They carried only what they could on their backs and were given little more than the shirt on their backs and a pair of breeches. As the 2 groups set out from Uruba, they followed an old trail used by Cuban hunters. They traveled through dense jungle and swam across rivers, all the while battling mosquitoes, biting ants, and the elements. After several weeks of travel, they finally reached the Apalachicola River, which would become the first major river that they would follow in their journey. They named the river May and followed it north, exploring the surrounding area and encountering various Native American tribes. As they traveled, they made contact with several different Native American tribes, some of whom were friendly and others who were hostile. The conquistadors were generally able to maintain peaceful relations with the natives, although there were some skirmishes. One of the tribes they encountered was the Kiaha, who lived in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The Kiaha were a large and powerful tribe, and their chief Alibama was initially hostile towards the Spaniards. However, after Soto gifted him with some presents, including a red cap and a horse saddle, Alibama became friendly. He provided the Spaniards with food and helped them repair their boats. In exchange, the Spaniards gave the Kiaha a black coat, some embroidered handkerchiefs, a red cap, and a horse saddle. Another tribe they encountered was the Coosa, who lived along the Tallapoosa River. The Coosa were a smaller tribe than the Kiaha, but they were fierce warriors. They attacked the Spaniards on several occasions, but were eventually defeated. The conquistadors killed many of the Coosa warriors, but they also made some allies. One of these allies was a man named Chisca, who was the son of the Coosa chief. Chisca had been captured by the Spaniards during one of their battles, but Soto set him free and made him an offer. If he would help the Spaniards, they would help him regain his freedom and power among the Coosa. Chisca accepted the offer and became one of the most valuable assets to the conquistadors. He served as an interpreter, a guide, and a warrior, and he proved to be invaluable in their battles against the Coosa. Finally, the Spaniards reached the Mississippi River. They had been traveling for months and were exhausted. However, they knew that the Mississippi was the key to their success. They had heard rumors of a great city to the north, and they hoped that the river would lead them there. As they traveled up the Mississippi, they encountered even more Native American tribes, some of whom were friendly and others who were hostile. The conquistadors continued to press northward, determined to find the source of the river and the great city they had heard so much about. Along the way, they suffered from disease, starvation, and attacks by hostile natives. But they pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and glory. Finally, on the banks of the Mississippi River in present-day Louisiana, they built a fort and settled in for the winter. They called the settlement Nuestra Señora de los Remedios, or Our Lady of Remedies. They named the river Rio de los Reyes, or River of the Kings, in honor of the Spanish monarchs. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of part 1. Join me next time as we continue the story of Hernando de Soto and his journey into the unknown. I promise you won't want to miss a single moment. Thank you for listening. This episode was brought to you by our generous supporters. If you would like to help us make these videos, please consider making a donation. The link is in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. I'll see you next time. Alright, Chapter 2, The World of 1539, Spain and the New World. Let's do this thing. Okay, so let's go back to the map again and we zoom in on this area right here, because this is where our story begins. This is what the world looked like in 1539, and look at this massive area that has been explored, conquered, and claimed by European powers. These are mostly Portuguese and Spanish colonies. They have these trading posts all over the place. They're in India. They're in Africa. They're all over the coast of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. But look at this huge gap right here. What is this huge gap? That's North America. It's practically a secret. There's one little French trading post up here in Canada, but it's unknown. No one really knows what's going on over there. And if you were alive in Spain in 1539, you would have heard about this new land. You would know that the Spanish had established colonies in Cuba and in Puerto Rico, and they've got Hispaniola, which is basically Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They've got Jamaica, they've got these islands over here in the Bahamas. They've got this huge area in Central America, and they've got Mexico. They own Mexico. And they also have this huge area in South America. They own most of South America, and people in Spain would have known this. People in Spain would have heard about this, and they would have thought to themselves, wow, there's a lot of gold down there. I mean, we just started exploring this stuff. We're finding giant piles of gold everywhere. I mean, we took over the Inca Empire, and they had all this gold and silver in Peru. And then we went to Mexico, and they had all this gold and silver there too. And then we started to hear rumors about this El Dorado, this golden man. We keep hearing about this golden man in these stories that come back from explorers. So there's a lot of gold in this part of the world. But there's one place that no one has really explored yet. They don't really know much about it. They know it exists, but they don't really know what's going on there. That place is North America. Okay, so if you're a conquistador or an explorer in Spain in 1539, you're looking at this map and you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is all the stuff we own. This is all the stuff we've explored. This is where the natives have gold. This is where the Aztecs had all those temples made out of gold, and where the Incas had all their silver mines. So you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, what's over here? Like, what's over here? Is there gold in this area? Is there some kind of civilization like the Aztecs or the Incas or something like that? Maybe we can take over another empire and add it to the king's holdings. That would be pretty neat. Or maybe there's just a bunch of gold. Just imagine finding a bunch of gold. So with that question in mind, that curiosity, I guess, in 1539, the Spanish decided to send an expedition north. They were gonna send someone into this huge unknown territory. They sent Hernando de Soto. Now, why did they send de Soto? Well, he'd already done this kind of stuff before. He was a conquistador. He'd helped conquer areas for Spain, and he was experienced. So they gave him a commission to go up into this area, explore it, and see what they had. So let's follow along as de Soto goes into this new area. Okay, so de Soto is heading north. He crosses over the Isthmus of Panama and he enters into the territory that today we call Colombia. And he's looking around and he's seeing these villages, and the people in these villages have gold. And he's like, oh great, this is gonna be an easy conquest. And then he keeps going north and he finds out that these people don't have any gold. In fact, they have nothing compared to the people further south. And so he's like, oh, this is disappointing. I came all this way and these people have nothing. And then as he continues his journey north, he's gonna realize that the farther north he goes, the less developed these societies are. And that's a big shock to him because he's coming from an area where, in his mind, the closer you get to the equator, the more advanced the society. And here he's finding that that's not true. And he gets to a point where he realizes that the people in this area don't even have an agricultural society. They're still hunter-gatherers. And this is very shocking to him, because he is used to going into these villages and seeing great cities, seeing temples made out of gold, seeing the king's tribute of gold and silver. And here he's seeing people who live in huts, people who are nomadic, who don't grow their own food, who don't have domesticated animals. And he's shocked by this. He's totally shocked by this. And he doesn't understand it. And he does write about it. He describes it in his journal, but he doesn't really understand it. And neither does anyone else in Spain. No one understands what's going on up here. The other thing that happens to de Soto is that the farther north he goes, the colder it gets. And he is not happy about that. In fact, in his journal, he says that it's so cold up here that you have to carry your house on your back. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, the houses that people live in up here are made of wood and they're built above ground. And he is used to the houses in Spain and in the south where they remade out of adobe and they rebuilt kind of close to the ground. And so he's like, look, if you live in a house made of wood, you gotta build it off the ground because otherwise, when winter comes, the snow is gonna pile up and you're gonna be buried underneath your house. So you have to carry your house on your back. And he thinks that's ridiculous. And he's constantly complaining about how cold it is and how he's miserable. The other thing that's happening is that he's getting sick. He's getting sick of eating venison. Venison is deer meat, okay? And he's just tired of eating this. He wants something else. And the only problem is that there's nothing else to eat. There's no domesticated animals in this area. There's no chickens. There's no cows. There's no pigs. There's none of that stuff. So he's just stuck with venison and he's tired of it. But finally, after all of this, after all the cold and the snow and the strange people and the lack of gold, he finally makes it to the coast. And when he sees the ocean, he thinks he's found the Pacific Ocean. He doesn't realize that he's actually on the Gulf Coast of the United States. He thinks he's on the Pacific Coast. And when he sees this, he thinks he's reached the end of the earth. And he's like, okay, we've gone as far as we can go. There's nothing beyond this. This is the edge of the world. And he turns around and he goes back and he dies in the process. He comes down with an infection and he dies. But what did he find? Well, he found Florida. He found the entire southeastern part of the United States. But really, that's not what he was looking for. He was looking for gold. He was looking for the riches that he'd seen in Mexico and in Peru. And he didn't find that. And so he wasn't really interested in what he found. But the people back in Spain were very interested in what he found. They were curious about this place because he was the first person to bring back reports about it. And they started to think about this area and its potential. And they realized that, wow, this could be a great area to have. And so they sent more expeditions into this area. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and I am glad we got to meet in this course. I hope you learned a lot, and if you need help, I'm gonna put some links down below. Thank you so much for watching. Hello and welcome to Chapter 3 of our series, The Man Behind the Expedition. If you're new here, then hello and welcome, and if you're returning, then thank you for doing so. We really appreciate it. In this series, we look at some of the most influential people in world history and examine their role in events that shaped our world. Now, although there have been many notable explorers and conquerors in history, few are as infamous as the conquistador Francisco Pizarro, and there's probably no one more instrumental to the fall of the Inca Empire than he was. But what did Pizarro himself get out of his adventures? Honestly, not much. He didn't gain any personal wealth or land for himself. In fact, he died believing that he had been swindled out of his rightful share of the spoils. But when it came to gaining power, well, there were few who benefited more than he did. But he wasn't the only one from his original homeland of Spain to profit. In today's episode, we're going to look at the man who funded Pizarro's expeditions and became immensely wealthy because of them. We're talking about Hernando de Soto, a member of a powerful Spanish noble family from the region of Andalusia. Hernando was born around 1496, although some sources say 1500. Regardless, he would have been just a boy when his father, Hernando de Soto Velázquez, governor of the Spanish province of Lorena, was sent by Ferdinand and Isabella to oversee the colonization of the recently conquered lands of Nicaragua and Honduras. As soon as he was old enough, Hernando de Soto joined his father in the New World. Unfortunately, their time in Central America was marked by constant warfare with the indigenous tribes, and in 1524, when Hernando Sr. was killed in battle, the colony was abandoned and the younger Hernando was forced to flee with his life. It was at this point that he began his long and distinguished career as a soldier. Fighting alongside the conquistadors, de Soto proved himself to be a capable and ruthless warrior, which caught the eye of his commander, Francisco Pizarro, and when Pizarro returned to Spain to seek royal approval for an expedition to conquer the Inca Empire, he brought de Soto with him as his right-hand man. While in Spain, de Soto married into the family of a Spanish nobleman, Francisco de Ca, and was able to use his wife as dowry to finance his portion of the cost of the expedition. This made him a partner in the venture and entitled him to a share of the profits. The Spanish monarchs gave Pizarro's request for permission to conquer the Inca the green light and appointed him and his partners, including de Soto, Adelantado, governors of all of the lands they might conquer. In 1532, the fleet carrying the conquistadors and their troops landed in modern-day Ecuador. The Spaniards marched inland, eventually reaching the Inca capital of Cajamarca later that year. Pizarro managed to trap the Inca emperor, Atahualpa, and his army inside the city and subsequently executed him and seized control of the empire. The Inca fought back against the Spaniards, but after suffering heavy casualties in battle, they agreed to a peace treaty which granted the Spaniards more land and forced the Inca to pay a massive ransom in gold. Though this treaty seemed to guarantee the riches promised to the conquistadors, Pizarro and his partners wasted no time in seizing even more land and riches for themselves. With de Soto firmly at his side, Pizarro led his men south through the Inca heartland, defeating the Inca armies and claiming the lands they conquered for Spain. De Soto was given charge of building settlements in the newly conquered lands, and he also took part in battles against the Inca, including the siege of the last Inca stronghold, Vilcabamba, in 1535. When the city fell, de Soto was put in charge of taking the Inca nobility to Cajamarca to be executed or held for ransom. The Inca king's ransom, by the way, was never paid, and most of the Inca nobility were killed. After subduing the Inca, Pizarro and his partners began to divide the spoils. They split the empire into three, with each man getting one section. Though Pizarro got the largest portion, which included the capital, he gave a smaller section to de Soto, who in turn allowed his partner Diego de Almagro to take a third of his territory. Almagro was actually the one who first discovered the silver mines, of which turned out to be the richest silver mine in the world, so de Soto struck it pretty good. However, he wanted more, and he believed that he was entitled to more. There was tension between the three partners over how the spoils were divided, and eventually the King of Spain had to step in and settle the dispute. While the king ruled that Almagro was to keep his initial holdings, the land that de Soto originally got was ruled to belong to Pizarro. The king also awarded Pizarro even more land, including the entire viceroyalty of Peru. So in the end, de Soto didn't get quite as much as he wanted, but he still ended up with a massive amount of land, making him one of the richest men in the world. He also received further confirmation of his new noble rank. Charles V appointed him as a member of the Order of Santiago, one of the highest orders in Spain at the time, and gave him the title of Marquis of Santiago. Just to hammer home how much Spain was elevating its conquering heroes at this time, Charles V's son and successor, Philip II, granted another title to conquistadors who had fought in the Inca conquest. You can probably guess the name of this order, too. Yep, it was called the Order of the Conquest. While none of Pizarro's partners achieved such heights of power and prestige, though De Soto is often forgotten in the shadow of Pizarro, despite his crucial role in the Inca conquest, he had been involved in several other enterprises in South America and was considered a skilled administrator when he was unbusy fighting. When Pizarro was executed in 1541, De Soto served as governor of Peru for 2 years before returning to Spain. Once back in Europe, De Soto lived a life of luxury and pleasure, spending his days hunting and hawking and his nights carousing with beautiful women. Even though he was almost twice her age, he married one of the most beautiful women in Spain, a 17-year-old Leonor de Tallada. The couple had several children together and spent their days enjoying their lavish estates. But De Soto wasn't satisfied with simply living off his investments in Peru. He dreamed of having his own empire. He convinced King Charles to grant him permission to establish a settlement in the area of present-day Florida and sailed to the New World once again in 1539 to begin his new enterprise. Unfortunately, the settlement he founded, which he named San Agustin, was abandoned after only a few months due to disease and conflict with Native Americans, and De Soto continued exploring Florida until he reached the Mississippi River, where he died of a fever on June 1542. He was only 46 years old. Although he was unsuccessful in establishing a settlement in North America, his brother, Alonso de Sotomayor, did become a prominent figure in the colonization of Chile and Argentina. As you can see, the De Soto family definitely benefited greatly from the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Hernando de Soto is often overlooked when discussing the conquistadors, but without his support, Pizarro's conquest of the Inca may never have happened. In fact, Pizarro himself admitted that De Soto was the bravest man he ever saw in his life. However, despite being a capable administrator and soldier, De Soto is mostly remembered for his immense wealth, which could easily buy a person everything they desired. But what do you think? Do you think De Soto got his fair share of the Inca spoils? Let us know in the comments. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. We'd love to have you join the family. Also be sure to check out our site for more information about the conquistadors and other historical figures like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. Thanks for watching. Alright, so we've reached chapter 4 of our retelling of the tale of the conquistadors who went in search of the mythical Fountain of Youth. This is the one where they set sail for Florida. Let's get into it. We last left off with our boys getting ready to depart Spain for Cuba on their quest to find gold and glory in the New World. And now that everybody has been accounted for and the ships are loaded down with all of their supplies and armaments, the entire fleet set sail west across the vast Atlantic Ocean towards the New World. In the meantime, let's take a moment to appreciate just how massive this expedition was, not just for its time but in general. It is well documented that over 600 men joined the expedition, but the number actually fluctuates depending on which account you read. But in this telling, I'm going with a nice round 600 men between soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and adventurers. They were accompanied by 23 tons of supplies and equipment packed aboard 3 ships, along with hundreds of horses, pigs, war dogs, and assorted livestock. Here's a list of everything brought on the ships, according to one of the accounts. First, they brought 6 watertight chests containing 2,000 crosses, 8,000 church bells, 12 tons of bricks, nails, and other materials for construction. Then there was also 2 barrels full of wheat for sowing. Also brought 2 watertight chests with 1,200 Genevine, meaning Genoese crossbows, along with their respective ammunition. They also brought 8 barrels of powder, 12 barrels of wine, 2 watertight chests with armor and clothing, 1 barrel of vermouth and 1 barrel of vinegar. They also brought along 8 watertight chests with books, bedding, farming tools, fishing gear, as well as various instruments for mass and other religious ceremonies. They brought along 600 stone millstones, 800 axes, swords and daggers, along with an assortment of rope, rigging, iron pots, dishes, glasses, chains, and padlocks. Then there was also brought 20 watertight chests with food supplies like cheese, figs, nuts, dried fruit, oil, lard, vinegar, honey, and sugar. Also brought 2 barrels of fish and salted meat, along with several live domestic animals like sheep, goats, cows, horses, hunting dogs, pigs, and chickens. Phew, that is quite the list. Now I didn't even include the personal effects each man would have brought with him, like clothing, combs and razors, etc. Just imagine how much space that took up in the holds of the ships. Okay, so the ships carrying all of these supplies and men set sail from Spain and made their way through the Canary Islands before making landfall in Cuba. The plan was for the fleet to stop in Cuba first, then send out some reconnaissance missions while sending back to Spain for more men and supplies. A small settlement was built at the harbor of what is now known as Baracoa in eastern Cuba and named it San Salvador. This was done in hopes of establishing a base of operations from which they could launch expeditions into Florida. Men were assigned jobs in the settlement like farming, carpentry, and blacksmithing. The plan was to use this time to prepare themselves for the campaign in Florida. And here's where we get the first real taste of the greed that was a big motivator for the Spanish conquest of the Americas. When news of their arrival reached a local indigenous people, they came to trade with the Spaniards. They had never seen white men before and assumed that they were gods or angels. The Spaniards took advantage of this by charging exorbitant prices for mundane items like combs, scissors, and handkerchiefs. These poor natives were essentially getting fleeced. It's really disheartening to read about, because it shows how quickly these guys resorted to taking advantage of others for personal gain. But after 3 months, the reinforcements and supplies did arrive from Spain. They had expected at least 1,500 men to arrive, but were disappointed when only 450 arrived with them. So they decided to hold off on going to Florida for another month, setting sail in May of 1539. Now, there was still plenty of things to do before departure, like building boats for exploring the coast, like canoes and shallops. Canoes are light, narrow boats pointed at both ends, typically propelled with paddles. Shallop is a type of boat used for coastal navigation and can be propelled with oars, sails, or paddles. Alright, so back to the story. They outfitted 15 of these canoes and 2 shallops and loaded them up with provisions and arms, then assigned a crew to each vessel. The main fleet consisted of 3 ships, the Santiago, the Trinidad, and the San Lucas. Each ship was equipped with 20 cannons with the capacity to fire either 4 or 5-pound cannonballs, so they were pretty hefty. The men were given final instructions by the leaders, particularly the bishop who instructed the men on how they should treat the native inhabitants. He told them to try and convert them to Christianity, but to do so peacefully. He said they were not to kill any indigenous people unless attacked, nor were they to harm women, children, or the elderly. They also reminded everyone why they were there. They were looking for gold and or El Dorado, but most importantly, they were looking for the legendary Fountain of Youth, which supposedly had magical restorative powers. Whoever found it would achieve great fame and fortune. So with all of the preparation now complete, the men got aboard the ships and set sail for the new world. The mood among the men was a mix of emotions. Some were excited at the prospect of adventure, others were scared out of their minds, and some were just excited to be getting away from the strictures of life in Spain. There were all sorts of rumors about what they might encounter in the new world. Some said the natives were hostile, others said they lived in cities of gold. Still, others said there were rivers of gold in the land. Of course, none of that turned out to be true. The journey took a little over a month, and they began spotting land in late April. On April, they sighted land and made camp on an island they named Juventud, after the youth or Fountain of Youth they sought. This proved to be a wise decision, because there was already a sizable population of indigenous people living on the island. They noted that the island was beautiful and bountiful. The woods were filled with a variety of birds and wild animals, including deer and other edible animals. There were many springs on the island, and they noted that the water was so clear that they could see fish swimming around in it. They continued to sail south along the coast until they reached what is now Tampa Bay, where they landed on May. This was the beginning of their quest for gold and the Fountain of Youth. They would explore the surrounding areas and interact with the native populations, searching for any signs of wealth or the mystical spring that was rumored to be somewhere in the region. What they would find would change history forever. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to hear more stories like this, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me a lot. I appreciate every one of you who watches these videos. We're getting close to a major milestone. Thanks to your support, and I hope you keep enjoying the series. We've got a lot more to go. As always, stay safe out there. Chapter 5 Into the Florida Wilderness. Florida was an absolute nightmare. Dense forests everywhere. There were some clearings, but they weren't maintained by people. There were places where fires had burned and killed off all the trees, or where hurricanes had come through and just flattened everything. Swamps were everywhere. There were also mosquitoes, biting ants, biting flies, and the heat. Oh God, the heat. It was like the rainforest, only worse, because there wasn't any rain. The only good thing about this place was that it seemed to be completely empty. But that wouldn't last long. Before we arrived at our winter camp, we would have to pass through the territory of two native tribes, the Timucua and the Apalachee. Do not know much about either tribe except for what I've read in books since I came here. The Timucua lived on the east side of the peninsula, mostly along the coast. The Apalachee were inland, farther west. We were going to be passing through both of their territories, and I knew we were going to have problems. The first contact happened 3 days after we left our port. Our men were walking along a path near a creek when they saw a Native American coming toward them. He was tall and muscular, dressed only in a breechcloth and armed with a bow and arrow. My guess is he was the same kind of native that Daniel had seen the day before, one of those that the French called time to see you, which means barefoot. That was probably because they didn't wear shoes, but it could also mean that they went around in sandals made out of leather thongs. Some natives wore sandals, but most went barefoot. As soon as the native saw our men, he turned and ran. Now, if he'd been friendly, we would have given him something and sent him on his way. But when they ran away, we took it as a sign of hostility. So my men gave chase. Soon the forest echoed with shouts and the thud of feet on the soft ground. Finally, the native slipped between two trees and disappeared into the thicket. And that ended our pursuit. After that, we saw lots of natives, but none of them wanted to talk to us. Some were friendly at first, then ran away. Others ran from the very start. A few shouted and screamed as they ran, and some threw small rocks and tried to poke us with sharp sticks. All this time, the Spanish were yelling back, threatening them and telling them to come closer so we could do them great harm, but the natives wouldn't have any of it. I talked to Garcia and asked him what he thought was going on. He said that these natives were afraid of us because of the horses and dogs and the guns and the clothing and the strange foods we were eating. Apparently, some of the natives had been watching us from the forest edge, and now they were afraid of us. This is what Garcia told me. He said it was best if we did not go looking for the natives, but if we were attacked, we should defend ourselves against them. We continued walking inland, trying to avoid the natives, and we began to see signs that they had been here recently. We found camps where they decooked their food and broken pieces of pottery that they had thrown away. We also found where they had sharpened their arrows and made knives out of the sharp rocks they decollected. Seeing all this stuff made us more cautious, and rightly so, because the next time we saw a native, he ran, but he was carrying a bow. We did not chase him, but we were ready to fight. One evening we were all sitting around the campfire, and Hernando came over to me and said, "There are many villagers around here, and we need to get busy building houses." I said, "We'll get to that tomorrow, but tonight we're gonna rest." Just then, Alonso came running up to us and said, "I was collecting firewood and nearly stepped on a snake. I don't know what kind of snake it was, but it was big." I said, "Don't worry about it. Probably just a harmless water moccasin. They're not dangerous." And just then Gomez came running up to us, and he was even more excited than Alonso. "A water moccasin," he said. "That's exactly what it was," and I stuck my finger in its mouth and it bit me. I looked at his hand and sure enough, there were 2 spots where the snake's fangs had left red marks. "Come on, let's get out of here," I said, and everyone began gathering up their things and moving toward the riverbank. While we were getting ready to leave, another man came running. His name was Juan, and he was scared out of his mind. He said, "There's a fire in the forest and it's spreading fast. We got to get out of here." We dropped everything and started running. Behind us, we heard the trees cracking and popping as the forest burned. We reached the river just ahead of the flames, and we stood there watching as the forest burned and finally died out. When the smoke cleared, we untied the canoes and got in them and paddled downriver. One of the men with us had a knife, and when he felt his finger, it was swollen and hot. I looked at his hand, and sure enough, there was a red spot where the snake had bitten him. "This isn't good," I said. "If he gets a fever, he'll die." Then I gave some instructions to the others, and we started paddling. I gave him some water and helped him into a canoe. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we reached a little point of land with a sandy beach. We landed and set up camp. The man with the snake bite didn't get much sleep that night, but nothing else happened. In the morning he was still alive, but his hand was badly swollen, so I put him on the prayer table and asked God to heal him. Later that morning, We got in our canoes and headed up the river. By noon, we were getting low on water, so I told the men to paddle to the north bank and get some fresh water. As they pulled their canoes up on the bank, they could hear voices coming from the forest. They were shouting in a language that was new to us. My men froze and didn't move until the natives passed by and disappeared into the trees. Later that day, we reached a large clearing. There was a village in the middle of it, and we could see people walking around inside. I told my men to hide their faces behind the trees and follow me. We got close to the village, then we stopped and watched. Everything was new to them. They were seeing things they had never seen before, and they were wondering what we were doing. I told them to keep quiet and watch. Maybe we could learn something from them. For a while, no one spoke a word. Then we heard the sound of drums and someone began singing. The natives came out of their houses and formed a circle around the village green. They were making loud noises and beating their drums real hard. At first, I thought they might be preparing for battle, but whatever they were doing, it was too wild for that. I'd never heard anything like it. Then I noticed that one of the men was dancing. He was twirling around and making funny faces, and the rest of the natives were watching him closely. After a while, one of the women came out of the huts and joined the man in the center. She joined him in his dance, and pretty soon they had quite a crowd. Men and women were dancing and laughing and having a good time. The music was still playing and everyone was shouting and screaming. I leaned over to Garcia and asked him what was going on. He shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. He didn't know what they were doing either, but now I was interested in finding out. So I grabbed a spear and walked out of the trees and into the clearing. The moment I stepped out into the open, the drums stopped and everyone stared at me. I raised my hands in a friendly way and walked slowly into the circle. The woman and the man stopped dancing and the music started up again. Pretty soon I was part of their ceremony. I danced with the woman and later I danced with the man. They liked me. I think they were curious about me and maybe they thought I was one of their gods. I was just trying to figure out what they were doing and how I could fit in. Finally, I walked back to the woods and rejoined my men. They were surprised to see me come back alone, and they were even more surprised when I told them that the natives were friendly. We stayed there a couple of days, and every evening we would go to the village and join their dances. The people were friendly, and even though we couldn't speak their language, we managed to communicate. They gave us food and we gave them things like hats and belts and knives. We learned that they had no iron tools and that they used stone tools for everything. They were living very primitively, but they were happy and they were friendly. Their village was destroyed during the night by an earthquake, and we helped them rebuild it. They were very poor and had no extra food, but they shared what they had with us and we survived because of them. After a few weeks, we were ready to move on and establish our winter camp. We traveled light and moved quickly, following an old trail. We hadn't seen many natives for weeks, but we figured that we were close to one of their villages because we kept seeing signs that people had been there recently. We found campsites and trails and broken pieces of pottery and footprints. Late in the afternoon, we found a clearing and decided to make camp there. We built a fire and cooked some food and then settled down for the night. About midnight, we were awakened by screams in the forest, big guttural screams. We grabbed our weapons and sat around the fire, but nothing happened. Maybe it was just an animal, we thought, or maybe it was a native, who knows. In the morning, we found a lot of broken branches near our camp and a lot of footprints. But we couldn't tell if the footprints were made by man or beast. We packed up and moved on. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we came to a high ridge. The forest had thinned out and we could see the land sloping down to the south and the west. We could also see a river in the distance and a cluster of trees growing on a rise of land that looked like a fortified hill. "Look," I said, pointing to the trees. "That's where we're gonna build our winter camp." We hurried up the slope and sure enough, it was a perfect spot for a fort. The clearing was large enough and the trees were thick and tall and straight. We could use the trees for timber and the clearing for farming. Plus, the river was close by. We unloaded our horses and got to work building our houses. We cut down trees and made shelters to protect us from the rain and the bugs. And we made a big fire in the middle of the camp so we could cook our food and keep the predators away. We were so busy building our houses that we didn't see the natives until they were right on top of us. One minute we were working quietly and peacefully, and the next minute we were under attack. It was horrible. They were shooting arrows from hiding places behind trees, and when we tried to return fire, they ducked and ran away. All the time they were screaming and yelling, and we didn't know what they were saying. Every time we answered back, they laughed and made fun of us. It was embarrassing to say the least. We had lost all our supplies, and now we were being attacked by natives. I thought we were doomed. Our only hope was to run away and hide in the forest, and that's exactly what we did. We abandoned our camp and ran as fast as we could. We ran for hours, and I don't think the natives chased us because they must have thought we were crazy. I mean, who wouldn't? We were running away from everything and everybody. We were totally insane. Finally, we stopped and made camp. It was too dark to move on, and besides, we needed some time to catch our breath. We built a fire and roasted some nuts that we gathered, and we sat there thinking about how we could fix our problems. And that's where we'll end this episode. Next time we'll see how they solved their problems and hear about the battle for Anhika. If you're enjoying this series, please remember to hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Alright, chapter 6. Let's do it. March through the southeast. Okay, so we pick up where we left off at the end of chapter 5 with our two armies converging on the town of Darien, Georgia, or what today we call Darien, Georgia, but back then was called Darien, Georgia. And so they are coming from the north and they're coming from the west. And the combined army, when they get together, numbers about 2,000 men, and Hernando de Soto is in charge. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we say the word army, this is not like a standing army. They don't have uniforms. Most of them are wearing whatever civilian clothes they had on when they decided to go on this march. Some of them might have been wearing leather jerkins, but it is very unlikely that any of them were wearing steel armor, because they just didn't have that much metal. And the king wasn't really going to outfit 20,000 men in steel armor for a march through the wilderness. That was not something that was going to happen, so keep that in mind. So they meet at Darien, Georgia. They take some time to regroup, resupply. They also find some gold, which is always good. And then they start moving inland toward the Appalachian Mountains. They trying to find a route through the mountains into the interior of what we today call the southeastern United States. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind while they're remarching through here is that this area is absolutely beautiful. It's filled with game. There's lots of food to be had if you know how to find it. The weather is mostly pretty pleasant. It's warm, it's humid, but it's not terribly hot yet. It's not the middle of summer, so keep that in mind. This is an idyllic setting for a military campaign, except for one little detail. They're having an incredibly hard time getting through the terrain, because there are rivers everywhere. The first river they run into is the Altamaha, which is a fairly large river, and they spend 5 days building a raft fleet to cross everyone and everything across the river. They lose a lot of supplies, including firearms, and then they finally get all their people and everything else across the river and push on up into the interior. And that is when things start getting difficult. They are now entering an area that is covered in thick forest, impassable thickets. They are surrounded by what they called thickets, which is underbrush and small trees growing so close together that it's almost impossible to move through, and they're having a really hard time finding food. And this is going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the men are hungry and miserable and angry. But De Soto keeps pressing them on, up into the interior. And after about 3 weeks of slogging through the thickets and surviving on berries, they finally come across a clearing and a river. And that river is the Savannah River. And on the other side of the Savannah River, they can see smoke rising from a village. And that means there are people there, which means there is food to be had. And so they cross the river, they march on the village. And the village belongs to a nation of Native Americans called the Creek. Now, the Creek are certainly not the only nation of Native Americans living in this part of the country. In fact, there are several different nations here, including the Kofi Teshekwi. We'll talk about them in a moment. But the Creek are the ones that live closest to the Spanish. When the Spanish arrive, there are 2 villages of the Creek located near the Savannah River. They are quite close to each other. The Spanish arrive, they attack both of these villages. The first one they attack, they totally destroy it. They kill everyone who is there, burn all the houses, pillage everything they can carry, and then they move on to the second village. At the second village, the Spanish are expecting the same thing, a total victory over the natives. But they run into a much larger group of Creek than they were anticipating. They've marched over 2,000 men this far inland, and they have less than half of that left now, and so they're outnumbered. Hernando de Soto knows he's outnumbered. He also knows that his men are starving and exhausted, and so instead of fighting a battle he knows he cannot win, he does something really smart. He pretends to be friendly, and he actually sends a letter begging the chief for help. Now, this letter is written in an old colonial language called Spanish, and it's basically saying that we are lost and alone in your land. We would like to be your friends. If you will help us, we will gladly repay you in the future. And the chief reads the letter and he thinks, great, these guys want to be our friends. Let's be their friends. And so the chief invites them into his town, gives them food, gives them water, allows them to rest, which is exactly what De Soto wanted. And then he asks the chief if he would be willing to trade some of his warriors to help them guide them through the wilderness. And the chief says, "Sure, I guess that's not a problem." De Soto has some of his men put to death, then takes the chief, puts him in chains and marches him out of town with the rest of the Spanish. Then he turns around and tells his men, "Follow me," and they all march away from the village. Now, once they're out of sight of the village, Hernando de Soto releases the chief and gives him a gift of some silver ornaments, and lets him go back to his village. And this is exactly what De Soto planned to do. He wanted to capture every chief they met and force them to march with the Spanish until he got through the wilderness. And then, at the end of the march, he planned to release them all and let them go back to their villages. So this is going to become a common tactic of De Soto's. Even though the natives that he meets are generally friendly and helpful, he still captures the chiefs and forces them to march with him. Then, as they are continuing their journey inland, the next nation of natives they run into is the Cofitashekwi. And this is another one of those situations where the natives are friendly, but De Soto still captures their chief and forces them to march inland with him. And by this point, the Spanish are getting desperate for food. They are subsisting almost entirely on the charity of the natives that they are visiting. They are not finding much food in the wild. They are starving. One night, De Soto decides he's going to do something drastic. He calls all the chiefs that he has captured together and he announces to them that he is going to execute them all tomorrow, unless they lead him to a place where he can get food for his men. Now, fortunately for De Soto, one of the chiefs that he has captured knows of a place where the Spanish can get food. And so the next morning, instead of executing the chiefs, De Soto is able to get food for his men and everyone survives. He is led to a place where there is an abundance of food. There are edible plants in the wild. There are deer in the area. There are bears in the area. And so the Spanish are finally able to resupply themselves and they continue marching inland. There's a couple more skirmishes with other native nations. We don't know exactly who all they fought, because the records are kind of sketchy on that. But they fought a couple more battles against some of the natives. Some of the alliances held up, some did not. And at the end of chapter 6, Hernando de Soto and his men are preparing to fight the last major battle of this leg of their journey. And the battle is with the Guali, who are a very powerful tribe of Native Americans living near the Savannah River. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Chapter 7, The Battle of Mabila, 1540. This is the most famous battle in the entire De Soto story. It's been written about in books, told in documentaries. They even made an episode of Cosmos about it. So when I say that everybody knows about this battle, I mean it. Of course, back in the 1540s, nobody knew any of this would happen, but still, here we are 5 centuries later, and people today know more about what happened in this one battle than they do about, I don't know, the entirety of the Magellan expedition or something. So let us tell the story of how Hernando de Soto and his army got their butts kicked by the Native Americans at the fortified town of Mabila, in present-day Alabama. Okay, so if you've heard about this battle before, then you probably already know that the location was the fortified town of Mabila, which in modern times is near the city of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. If you've never heard about it before, well, the town of Mabila was the seat of the chief Tuscaloosa, who was a powerful leader of a powerful tribe. This was way up north from where the conquistadors had been traveling, but they were going looking for gold. And since there had been reports of a large settlement in this area, that's where they went. The settlement itself was huge. According to the accounts of the Spanish, there were 2,500 warriors in the town, although that number has been called into question by historians, who put the figure closer to around 500 warriors. Still, either way, it was a large force. We know that much. The town was protected by a palisade wall made of wood and a deep wide moat that was filled with water. All in all, it was quite the fortress. And the locals, who were led by Chief Tuscaloosa, were not afraid to use it to defend themselves against the invaders. So the first day that the Spanish arrived, they tried to talk their way into the city, but the chief wouldn't let them in. He basically said, "No, get out of here. You're not welcome." So then the Spanish decided they needed to take the city by force. And so they began to build a fort nearby and wait for the right moment to attack. And the right moment came when the Spanish were able to build a boat and send it across the river to spy on the city. When they spied on the city, they saw that all the warriors were out in the fields, tending to their crops. So the Spanish thought, "Hey, great, the coast is clear, let's attack." And they did. The men set off toward the city, and they were met by a heavy rain that flooded the moats and washed away the palisades, giving the Spanish easy access into the city. From there, it was just kill, kill, kill. The Spanish, who were carrying swords and firearms, had no trouble against the Native Americans, who mainly fought with bows and arrows and clubs. Hundreds of Native Americans were killed. But then the fighting ended abruptly when Tuscaloosa showed up. Apparently, he had been in the fields working when the attack started, and when he saw his city being overrun, he grabbed his weapons and ran like hell to try to stop the invaders. But when he got there, he found himself face to face with Hernando de Soto. These two men fought in pretty much every account of the battle, as them killing each other. There are different versions of what actually happened, but in the end, it doesn't matter because both of them died. In some versions, Tuscaloosa kills De Soto, and in other versions, De Soto kills Tuscaloosa. Either way, they're both dead. As soon as their leaders were gone, the remaining Native Americans dropped their weapons and surrendered to the Spanish. And once the dust had settled, the Spanish counted their riches. They found golden ornaments, weapons and statues, and it looked like they had finally struck it rich. But then it started to rain again, and the rain washed away all the gold and turned it into worthless mud. According to the account of the chronicler, when the men realized that all the gold had been washed away, their faces fell and they started to weep. The author wrote, "They felt so great a disappointment, and such profound despair that many of them wished to die rather than live to see or suffer more." We know now that the wealth of the Native Americans wasn't in gold and silver. Had the Spanish taken the time to look for it, they would have found plenty of copper and iron tools, maybe even some pearls. But they weren't interested in that. They wanted gold and silver and jewels, and since they didn't find any of that, they thought that they had nothing when in reality, they had plenty of valuables to pillage. But I mean, what do they know? They aren't historians. When the men weren't weeping over their failure to find gold, they were tending to their wounds. They took several casualties during the battle and had to leave behind many of their dead and dying. The chronicler wrote, "Of our own men, 3 were killed and 5 or 6 severely wounded. We buried 2 of our comrades who died that night, one of whom had been stabbed in the leg by a bamboo spear and another who had been shot in the knee with an arrow." That sounds like not too bad, but keep in mind, they also lost their leader, Hernando de Soto, who died during the battle. Yeah, normally, when you lose your leader during a battle, you want to pack up and go home. But these guys were still looking for gold, so they kept going. They left the town in ruins and set off to find new riches. I don't really understand why they kept going. Like this was supposed to be the greatest city of gold. They burned it down and didn't find any gold. What more do they need to find to realize that there isn't any gold to be found here? Then again, I guess. I mean, I'm just some random dude talking to a screen. What do I know? In any case, these guys kept going. They traveled up a river until they reached another village. Here they stayed for a while, traded with the natives, and healed up. They also held a funeral for Hernando de Soto. They buried him at sea, threw dirt into the water and left him behind. After the burial, they named the place Cape Despair, probably in reference to how they felt after finding no gold in the previous battle. From there they continued north until they reached the Cold Lands, as they called it, where there were no more settlements and no more gold. At this point, their goal was just to get out of this strange land and head back south. As they traveled through the Cold Lands, they encountered a few Native American tribes. They fought and battled with them, but overall, they mostly just got beaten up by them. By this point, there were only about 300 soldiers left. They were sick of fighting and sick of the cold. They just wanted to go home. Then, luckily, they found a river that was flowing south, and when they followed it, they eventually found a road that led them to a Spanish settlement. They walked onto the road and began walking south. The chronicler wrote, "And thus ended our arduous and sorrowful journey of 7 long years in which God permitted us to return to this port after so many hardships, perils and dangers of every kind." Now, normally, when an expedition is finished, you would think that the people would come out the other side stronger, more confident, happier to be alive, you know? But this wasn't the case with the men who survived the De Soto expedition. The truth is, the men were pretty broken. They had been through hell and back. Many of them had seen things that they couldn't unsee, done things they couldn't undo, and they were just plain tired of it all. The brutal treatment at the hands of the Native Americans during the Battle of Mabila, plus the loss of their leader De Soto, had a huge impact on the survivors. Not to mention, they had been through years of hardship. They had been lost in the wilderness for 7 years. They had explored thousands of miles of land. They had seen wonders and horrors. They had fought hundreds of battles, they had seen countless friends and allies die horrible deaths, and they had seen unspeakable acts of violence committed by both themselves and others. All of this had worn them down, and it was clear that they needed a break from exploration and conquest. The men just wanted to go home. Thank you for watching. In our last episode, we left off with Hernando de Soto and his men still wandering through the wilderness of what is today Mississippi. They've been here a while now, and their hopes of finding the gold that they came for are beginning to dwindle. And they have no idea that their fate is about to get even worse. It's me. This is the story of the conquistadors and the first European to set foot in the modern United States. Chapter 8. The Search for El Dorado of the Southeast. The men had hoped that the thick, heavily wooded area they were in was the interior of an island, one that was rich with gold. But after more days than any of them could remember, they realized this was not the case. In fact, they had traveled more than 200 leagues from the coast, and still there was no sign of water, only land. While they were traveling along a river, hoping it would lead them to the sea, they found villages belonging to the Koroa tribe. They did not stay long though, because the local chief was aggressive and warlike, and the men needed to keep moving if they were going to have any hope of getting out of this god-forsaken jungle. By late summer, De Soto was beginning to panic. He had come all this way and had nothing to show for it, but a few villagers and a handful of natives who had willingly or unwillingly joined his army. But he was still hopeful that somewhere over the next mountains or around the next bend in the river, he would find the riches that had brought him to this land. But deep down, he knew his time was running out. If he didn't find gold soon, his men would kill him for leading them on such a fool's errand. But they did not know that the hardships they were about to endure would make the journey to this point seem like a walk in the park. As fall began, so did the rains. For the next 3 months, it rained almost every day, turning the ground into a thick, stinking mud. Many of the men fell sick, and those who had not already lost their shirts quickly found themselves naked and barefoot. It seemed like every misfortune imaginable was coming at them from every direction. Then the biting cold of winter descended upon them. There was no more wood to use for fires, because the men had used every tree they could find to sustain themselves. The nights were cold enough to freeze a man solid if he didn't have shelter, and food was getting scarce. They lived on what little maize the natives had given them, but most of it had been used up during the long marches. Now hunger began to take its toll on the men. They grew weaker and weaker by the day, and could muster barely enough strength to move forward. And to add insult to injury, they were infested with lice and mosquitoes, which made sleep almost impossible. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, they did. One by one, the men began to die. At first it was only 1 or 2 a day, but soon it was 5, 10, 20 men a day. Some died of starvation, others of disease, and many simply dropped down dead of exhaustion. Seeing all these men die every day was hard on De Soto and his officers. They tried everything they could to raise the men's spirits, but it was nearly impossible. All anyone could think about was food and the lack of it. And so it was that after 4 long months of misery, only 267 men remained out of the nearly 2,000 who had landed in Florida. With the death rate increasing every day, De Soto knew he had to do something drastic to save what was left of his army. He decided to try to find the sea again. Surely if they could get back to the coast, they could live off the fish and fruit until help arrived. They had wandered so far inland that getting back to the coast would be just as difficult as getting there, but they had no choice. They started following a river that the natives told them would lead them to the sea. They traveled for weeks, subsisting on fish and wild fruit, but the river seemed to have no end. Just when they thought it was impossible for the river to stretch on any longer without reaching the ocean, they saw a small group of natives paddling out to them in canoes. When they got close enough, the men could hear them shouting, "Beware, beware," and one of them called out, "You are on our hunting grounds. Don't enter them again." The men shouted back, "We wish to go down that river to the sea." But the natives warned them that the river belonged to the great lord of those parts, and if they went there, they would be killed. Desperate for food and tired of living off the meager vegetation, the men ignored the warning and paddled further down the river. As soon as they passed the last of the native villages on the river, the shooting began. Ball after ball whizzed over their heads, splashing into the river and sending up white clouds of spray. A young conquistador named Garcia Lopez de Cardenas wrote, "We returned the fire, but our guns are so cumbersome that we could not load them with the agility required to defend ourselves against so many archers. Besides, we had no desire to kill them since we were going to eat them." After the sun had set, the Spaniards stopped paddling and made camp on a little sandbar in the middle of the river. Cardenas wrote that the men were so hungry that they were ready to eat anything they could catch, but unfortunately, nothing was biting. Then suddenly, the men heard voices, but they were unlike any they had heard before. They were loud, harsh, and guttural. Then they saw torches coming toward them across the river. The men panicked and prepared to fight, but whatever was coming did not attack. Instead, a group of natives paddled up to the boats and began talking to the men. They wanted to know who they were, where they came from, and what they were doing there. When they heard that the Spaniards were from a faraway land and that they were looking for food, they invited them to a village nearby to rest and eat. But the Spaniards suspected a trap and refused. The natives then paddled away, leaving the men alone in the dark. The men did not dare leave camp, so they sat around in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest. Cardenas wrote, "All that night we heard noises of all kinds, some near at hand, others in the distance, as well as screams in the forest, some low, others so loud that they seemed to shake the heavens. When dawn broke, the men were too afraid to move. They stayed in their boats until late into the morning, expecting an attack at any moment, but none came. Finally, when they were sure the danger had passed, they went ashore and started a fire and made some breakfast. After eating, they started exploring the area to see if there was any game they could hunt. But they had barely walked 50 paces when a group of natives appeared and began shooting arrows at the Spaniards. They ran back to the river as fast as they could, but the natives followed, continuing to fire arrow after arrow at the men. Cardenas wrote, "One of our soldiers was hit and fell down. The Indians wanted to kill him, but seeing that he was alive, they stripped him naked, scalped him, and cut off his ears and nose. Then they tied him to a tree and left him there. While this was happening, the others swam toward our boats. We could do nothing but watch, paralyzed with fear, while our companions were being massacred, mutilated, and put to death in horrible fashion. When the men got back to their boats, they found that during the attack, one of them had stolen a canoe and was trying to paddle away. The men grabbed him and pulled him back to shore, then stripped him naked and beat him severely. Realizing that they were doomed, the men fought back, killing one of the natives and taking his head as a trophy. The others fled, and the men divided the spoils, each taking what they could carry. Then they did something that shocked everyone who knows their story. They burned the rest of the boats and all their supplies and equipment, leaving them stranded in a strange land with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single knife and a small hatchet. What little food they had managed to salvage from the natives quickly ran out, and they were forced to wander into the forest to hunt and gather what they could. This proved to be almost impossible, because the men had no knives to skin the animals they caught, and the thick underbrush soon tore up their already worn-out shoes. Within a few days, they were all barefoot and starving, and then the rains came. As if things couldn't get any worse, the ground became a thick, sucking mud. The men sank in up to their waists and had to help each other out or risk being stuck forever. Cardenas wrote, "We wandered through that infernal country, each man taking his own path, not knowing where he was going, for we had lost all hope of seeing our ships, believing ourselves abandoned by God and our Captain General, whom we held responsible for all the evils that had befallen us." Soto had led his men on a merry chase through the wilderness of the southeast, and now they were paying the price. But he still did not want to admit defeat. His pride wouldn't allow it. Even though the men had stripped him of his title and authority, he still considered himself the leader of the expedition, and he was determined to find gold, even if it meant sacrificing his men. And so it was that Hernando de Soto, the man who had discovered Florida for the Spanish, died in the wilderness of the American South, killed by the very people he had come to conquer. Stay tuned for Chapter 9, The Grim March West, where we follow the survivors of Soto's army as they flee for the coast. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below. Alvar Núñez de Cabeza de Vaca had been walking for months. In fact, he'd been walking since April, but today was different. Today they were going to reach the end of their journey. They were going to cross the mighty Mississippi River and reach the Pacific Ocean. It would be the first time in history that a European had crossed the Mississippi, and it was all thanks to a deal struck with a Native American tribe, one that involved a lot of alcohol and a fair bit of trickery. As he stood on the bank of the muddy river, waiting for his companions to bring the last of their supplies across, De Cava looked out at the fleet of canoes that were moored along the shore. These were the vessels that had brought him and his men across the Mississippi, vessels that had been provided by the Native Americans who had agreed to help them cross. Well, help might be pushing it a bit. The Native Americans hadn't exactly been keen to help. When De Oliveira and his men had arrived at the Mississippi, they'd been walking for months and they were exhausted. They were also starving. So when they'd met the local chief and told him of their plight, asking if he could provide them with boats to get across the river, the chief had seemed sympathetic. However, when the Europeans offered him some brandy in exchange for the use of the canoes, the chief had suddenly become very interested in their offer. So much so that he wanted more brandy and then even more until he basically bought the whole fleet of about 80 canoes. In return, he'd allowed the Europeans to use the canoes to ferry themselves and their horses across the river. Not that this had gone particularly smoothly either. As the Spaniards had begun loading up the canoes, the natives had become nervous. The chief had started demanding more and more alcohol from them, and they'd refused. Then the natives had attacked. The Spaniards had barely managed to defend themselves, and their horses had panicked and charged into the river. Fortunately, the river wasn't deep enough to cause the horses too many problems, so none had drowned. Unfortunately, though they'd lost several of their men and all of their supplies, when De la Vera had finally managed to placate the natives and buy back their supplies, they'd continued to load the canoes. Only this time they'd made sure to leave space in them for the horses. Once they'd loaded everything, they'd crossed the river. It had been a harrowing experience, fraught with danger, loss, and fatigue. But now standing there watching those same canoes bobbing gently on the current, De la Vera couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the power of the river. From where he stood, it was almost impossible to see across its muddy waters. He knew that it was nearly half a mile wide, but it could have been twice that or more. To him, it looked endless. The river was far wider than any he'd seen in Spain and deeper than any he'd seen in Mexico. Its current was strong and fast, and it carried with it an abundance of life. Fish jumped and splashed in the water and birds circled overhead. Even from this distance, he could hear the roar of the current and the crash of the water as it hit the bank. It was a sight that filled him with both wonder and fear. This river was unlike any he'd ever seen before, and yet it was here, in this place of immense natural beauty and raw power, that the Spaniards had decided to pitch their camp. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the men began to stir in the camp. Soon they were up and moving, getting ready to start the day's work. Cabeza de Vaca watched as they set about their tasks. Some were unloading the canoes, others were preparing breakfast, and still more were tending to the horses. It was a well-oiled machine, born out of necessity and hard work. There was little time for anything other than the essential tasks at hand. Cabeza de Vaca knew that they didn't have much time to waste. They needed to get across the river as soon as possible and establish a new camp on the other side. With the canoe fleet secured, the men began to unload the horses, leading them down to the riverbank. The horses were nervous, sensing the danger of the churning waters, but the men handled them with care and determination. With each horse safely in the water, the men would push off from the bank, guiding the animals towards the canoes. It was a slow and difficult process, but the men worked tirelessly, their muscles straining as they battled against the current. But slowly, steadily, they moved upstream, inching their way closer to the other side. Cabeza de Vaca felt a surge of pride as he watched his men work. They were tired and hungry, yet they pushed on, driven by their need to survive and their desire to explore. Their determination was inspiring and gave him hope for the future. As the hours passed, the men began to tire. The work was backbreaking and the heat was stifling, but they pressed on, their bodies aching and their spirits low. Still, they refused to give up. Then came the moment they had been working toward, the moment when the last horse reached the other side. It was a moment of triumph, a moment of relief. As the men stood on the bank, looking out at the river, they knew they had accomplished something truly remarkable. They had crossed the mighty Mississippi, but their work was not yet done. They needed to build rafts and ferries to transport the men and supplies across the river. The task was daunting, but they got to work with a will. They cut down trees and shaped them into sturdy rafts, lashing them together with vines and branches. They used the canoes to ferry the men and supplies back and forth, working around the clock to get everything across. As the days turned into weeks, the men began to despair. They were exhausted, hungry, and disillusioned, but still they worked, driven by their desire to survive and their determination to succeed. They knew that, if they gave up, they would likely die. So they pressed on, their bodies aching and their spirits broken. And then finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they finished. They had built enough rafts and ferries to transport themselves and their supplies across the river. It was a monumental achievement, an achievement born out of necessity and sheer willpower. But as the men stood on the shore, looking out at the river, they knew that it was only the beginning. They had crossed the Mississippi, but they were still in the middle of nowhere. They were alone in a vast, uncharted wilderness, surrounded by dangers they could not even imagine. And so they did what they had to do. They set about the task of exploring the unknown, driven by their curiosity and their need to survive. They pushed on, venturing into the wilderness, their hearts filled with both excitement and fear. They traveled for weeks, their canoes carrying them up and down the river. They explored the vast wilderness, discovering new plants and animals, encountering strange and wonderful people. Along the way, they faced danger and hardship, but they never gave up. They pushed on, determined to succeed. And finally, after a long and arduous journey, they reached the Pacific Ocean. It was a moment of triumph, a moment of pure joy. They had done it. They had crossed the Mississippi and reached the sea. But as they stood on the shore, looking out at the endless expanse of water, they knew that their journey was far from over. They had crossed the Mississippi, but they were still in a hostile land, a land full of danger and uncertainty. And so they did what they had to do. They set about the task of finding a way home, driven by their need to survive and their desire to return to civilization. They pushed on, journeying through the wilderness, their hearts filled with both hope and despair. And in the end, it was a journey that would change their lives forever. They had crossed the Mississippi, and in doing so they had discovered a new world. Though the crossing itself was a monumental achievement, it was ultimately a symbolic one. The river was so wide and so powerful that it was impossible to fully comprehend its scale. They had crossed it, but they had not really conquered it. Nature's raw power was something to be respected and feared, and the river was a constant reminder of that. Despite the danger and difficulty of the crossing, the reward for success was little. They had reached the Pacific, but it was a vast and empty expanse of water that offered them no real advantage. They were still in a hostile land, and the journey home was fraught with its own challenges. In the end, the crossing of the Mississippi was an achievement that had come at a great cost, a cost measured in months of hardship and privation. It was a testament to human endurance and determination, but it was not really a victory. The river had simply been too vast and too powerful to be truly conquered. So they had crossed the Mississippi, but they had not really won. They had simply survived. Chapter 10: The Fall of Hernando de Soto. It is November 1542. The Spanish conquistador. Hernando de Soto has been wandering around the southeastern United States for 2 years now, looking for gold and glory. So far, he hasn't found much of either, but he did manage to make it this far without being killed by the Native Americans, only to succumb to what we can assume was malaria, or as Cortés put it, a fever. There are differing accounts about how this came to pass. Some say he was just born with a fever and destined to die. Others say he contracted the illness from one of the slaves that had recently been taken from Florida. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how he got it. All that matters is that he got it bad, and by December he was too sick to continue on. His men wrote down these events in their chronicles, but most of them were really careful not to mention the real reason that they stopped. They didn't want word getting out to the local tribes that the Great White Conqueror was dying, because they knew those tribes would attack them in an instant. In fact, they wrote that De Soto was suffering from a strange illness, where he was delirious and talking nonsense, and after he fell unconscious, they put him on a raft and floated him down the river until he died. Then they left his body in the river and floated away. Honestly, given what we know about the treatment of indigenous peoples by the Spanish, it's kind of surprising that they were so considerate as to let him die peacefully. But that's how it went. The spot where he died is somewhere around here in modern-day Arkansas. There's some debate about exactly where, though. In fact, there's a lot of debate about this whole story. Most historians agree that De Soto did get sick, and that he did die in or very near to the Mississippi River. But some think that he actually died from wounds sustained in battle against the Native Americans, while others think he was murdered by his own men. But whatever happened to him, his body wound up in the Mississippi, and that may have been the end of it. Except for the rumors that survived about the mysterious white god, who came from the south with fire in his belly and left with the river. You see, when the locals heard about this strange white god who could turn people to stone with a single glance, and who unleashed horrible demons from the depths of the earth, they took it pretty seriously. In fact, they seem to have taken it more seriously than the Spanish ever did. You see, the Spanish never really treated De Soto as a god. Sure, he was important. He was the first Spaniard to set foot in much of the southeast, and the only one to make it this far west. But in the greater scheme of things, he wasn't that important. In fact, by the time he started his exploration of the southeast, he wasn't even a conquistador anymore. That title is reserved for men like Cortés and Pizarro, who conquer entire civilizations. By the time De Soto reached the Mississippi, he was little more than a bureaucrat. a man who was trying to keep order among the conquistadors and slaves that were sent to explore and conquer the South. In fact, by the time he died, he wasn't even that. He was just a regular old soldier, having been demoted by his own king for mistreating the natives. So yeah, the locals thought he was a god, but the Spaniards didn't. They saw him as a failure. But hey, the locals were right. And not just right, but more right than anybody else. Because after De Soto died, the Spaniards tried to cover up his death. See, the men who were with De Soto when he died, which was most of his army at that point, didn't want the natives to know what had happened. They were afraid that if they did, they would be attacked. And they would have been right to be afraid, because when the natives found out, they did attack. But before we get to that, let's finish talking about how the body of the great white god ended up in the river. There are several accounts of this, but most of them are pretty similar. As I mentioned earlier, Soto was put on a raft and floated down the river until he died. Then some of his men rowed ahead and selected a spot for burying him. It was on the south side of the river in a place that was probably swampy. Then they put his body in the ground and covered it over. They were careful to do all of this at night so the natives wouldn't see them. Then they floated back to camp and told everybody that the great white god had risen from the dead and was going back to Spain. Of course, they didn't tell anybody that he was really dead, that they had buried him in the river. They kept up this ruse for as long as they could, but eventually they had to tell somebody, and when they did, the news spread like wildfire. One of the men who heard the news was Alonso de Chavez, who was with the conquistadors when they found De Soto's body. When he heard that the great white god had come back to life, he ran to the village he was staying in and warned the chief that an army of white gods was coming to kill everyone. This wasn't really true, but it was close enough that the chief decided to run away. He and his followers abandoned their village and hid in the woods, and honestly, they probably made the right call because the conquistadors weren't exactly known for being reasonable. But the conquistadors weren't the only ones who were affected by this. As soon as the natives heard that the white god was coming, they prepared to defend themselves. They made weapons and armor out of materials that they had available, like wood and animal hides, and they made plans to fight the Spanish. And when the Spanish finally reached them, the battle was on. Now this isn't really something that the Spanish were used to. Up until this point, every battle that they had fought in the New World had been against people who didn't have metal weapons. They were fighting people who were still using stone tools. But the natives of the southeast were no different from the Aztecs and Inca in terms of their weaponry, and the Spanish knew this, so they were ready for it. They had already fought battles like this in Mexico and Peru. But despite this, they lost. In fact, they lost badly. The Spanish lost hundreds of men in this war, while the natives may have lost dozens, if that. The Spanish also lost everything that they had brought with them, including their food, their supplies, and their weapons. And what they didn't lose, the natives destroyed. So yeah, the natives won this battle, but they didn't win the war. The Spanish eventually came back with reinforcements and took what they wanted from the natives. And that's about how it always went when the Spanish encountered a new civilization. The natives put up a good fight at first, but eventually the Spanish overwhelmed them with their numbers and technology. And when the dust settled, the Spanish were left in control of the Mississippi Valley. They were also left with the knowledge that one of their own had died in the area. The rumor that had started in Florida about the great white god, who could turn people to stone with a single glance, had traveled all the way to the Mississippi by this point, and the locals were scared. They were so scared that they didn't even want to touch the conquistadors' bodies. They were afraid that if they did, they would turn into stone. So they just threw the bodies in the river and let them float away. And that's how Hernando de Soto, the man who had conquered Florida and explored much of the American South, died. No great fanfare, no parades, no monuments, just a fever, a raft, and a river. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so I can keep making more episodes. Thanks for watching. Alright, we are back with more of The Lost Expedition, an adventure that almost was. Chapter 11, A Leaderless Expedition. The men had just finished electing their new leader. Charles was elected captain, and Louis was elected second in command. Or so he thought until the other men came back from voting and told him he was unelected. As they all argued over who was going to be their leader, one of the others, Jacques Paris, proposed that they should go back to New Madrid. He said that they could get food and supplies there and probably find some horses. They then decided to send a group of 5 men back to retrieve these provisions. This was most likely done under protest because they did not want to elect a third leader. But it is important to note that this was a great idea. They should have done this before they left New Madrid. They had plenty of ammunition and firearms, so they wouldn't need any of that from New Madrid. but they were low on food and supplies. Going back would have been a smart move. 2 of the 5 men sent back never made it. They were killed by natives in an attack. The 3 that did make it back to New Madrid found the town abandoned, destroyed by a flood. Everything was underwater, so they couldn't salvage anything. They wrote down some notes on what happened to the town and then left. The rest of the story isn't really known, but it is assumed that they joined up with the rest of the group. So now they are stuck on an island with no food and no hope. So they decide to start killing some of the pigs. This way they can survive off of the land for now. They set out to kill as many pigs as possible, and after a week, they have enough pork to last them for quite some time. So they figure they should be okay for now. While they are killing these pigs, they also catch some fish and live off the land. So their hunger is satisfied, but there is still no sign of gold. They started sending people out each day to look for gold, and every single person came back empty-handed. Nobody had any luck finding any gold at all, so they grew weaker and lost even more hope. It seemed like everything was against them. First the flood, then the native attacks, then the long march through the wilderness, and now this. What else could go wrong? As the weeks passed, they became weaker and weaker. Their guns and rifles got heavier and heavier, and then one day a heavy rain began to fall. This made their guns even heavier, and they didn't have enough food to keep their strength up. They were so weak they couldn't walk. It took them hours just to go a few miles. They sat down and decided to wait for the rain to stop. Once it did, they continued walking, but they didn't make it very far before another rainstorm caught them off guard. They had no shelter and were soaked to the bone. They spent the night shivering in the rain. Many of them died during this time, but the exact number isn't known. Some sources say 8 men died and others say many men died. I believe many is a more accurate number because they were too weak to carry their guns and rifles. They didn't even have the strength to walk. It would have been impossible to bury these men, so they were probably just left there. As days turned into weeks, the group grew smaller and smaller. Their hope was growing dimmer and dimmer, and they started losing their minds. They didn't have any tobacco, so they started chewing on the bark of trees. One man suggested they should cut down trees and make rafts to float down the river. Another man suggested they build boats. This man was Louis, but his idea was shot down by the others. They were already desperate and didn't know how to build boats. They didn't want to waste their time on something that might not work. After much debate, they decided to abandon their inland journey and head back to Mexico. This was probably the best decision they could have made, because if they kept going inland, they would have all died. All of them were too weak to walk, so they sat down and waited for death to come. Some of them died, but others lived. How many died and how many lived is not known, but it was probably a small number of both. They started walking towards the Mississippi River, dragging their guns and rifles behind them. As they walked, they saw many dead bodies, both of men and animals, and the ground was littered with bones. They finally reached the Mississippi River and followed it to where they had crossed earlier. They then started walking up the river, looking for a place where they could cross. When they finally found a suitable spot, they dragged their guns and rifles across the river and left the boats behind. They continued following the river and eventually reached a French trading post. The people at the trading post gave them food and water, and then they made the long journey back to New Madrid. When they arrived, they found the town in ruins. Everything was destroyed and there was nothing left to salvage. The people at the trading post told them that the flood had come back and taken everything away. The men were then forced to stay at the trading post until they were strong enough to continue on their journey, and that is where we will end this video. This expedition was a total failure. They had high hopes when they left France, but those hopes quickly faded away. They suffered from constant setbacks and eventually lost everything. They also lost many men along the way. By the end of the expedition, only a handful of survivors remained. We now have one final question to answer. Did any of these men survive? We know that some of them did, but we don't know exactly who. This is because nobody knows exactly how many men died during this expedition. There are different numbers everywhere you look. If you read one source, it will say 8 men died, and then you read another source and it will say many men died. We also don't know exactly how many men there were during this expedition. Different sources give different numbers. At one point, there were about 100 men, but then it says that there were only about 60 men. Who is right? I don't know. There's so much conflicting information, and that's why I can't give you an exact number of how many men survived. But I can tell you that some of them did make it back to France. Out of the 34 men that left France, we know that 4 of them made it back to France. 4 men went missing, and we don't know what happened to them. The rest of the men either died or were executed. So if your ancestor was on this expedition, there is a good chance that they did not survive. Okay, so I have 2 questions for you. Number 1, do you think these men should have stayed on the island and tried to build boats? Or do you think they made the right choice by trying to get to Mexico? And number 2, do you think the French knew that these men were gonna die? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. That would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching. The year is 1528 and the location is Central America. Over 600 Spanish conquistadors are rowing their way downstream in a fleet of 11 boats. They have been traveling for weeks and their goal is to reach the mouth of the river and make it to the ocean. They have previously traveled inland up the river, pillaging and exploring, but now they are running out of food and supplies, and the journey back down the river is proving to be longer and more difficult than expected. Attacks from natives in canoes are constant and the men are exhausted from fighting. To make matters worse, there is a violent storm and one of the boats capsizes, injuring the captain, but after rowing non-stop for weeks, the desperate Spaniards finally see land and rush towards it. However, what they do not know is that the paradise they think they have found is actually an island full of bloodthirsty natives who will stop at nothing to defend their home. Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to discuss Chapter 12 of The Survivors by Ernest Thompson Seton. As always, if you would like to go ahead and grab yourself a copy of the book, I highly recommend it. And if you want to listen along with me today, I'll have a link for you in the description box below. Let's get started. The scene opens with our main character, a young conquistador named Estevanico and his group of fellow survivors rowing downstream for several weeks. Their objective is to find the mouth of the river, so that they can sail out into the ocean, and explore further to find some sort of settlement or friendly natives, who can help them in some way. The men are tired and hungry and they have little supplies left. They pass through lands inhabited by many hostile tribes who constantly harass them as they pass through their territory. The river has also been unusually high and fast, which makes their journey even more treacherous. Despite the difficulties, the men continue to press on in the hopes of reaching the sea. As I mentioned in the last video, this part of the journey is quite significant, because the previous parts were mainly about their journey up the river and their interactions with the natives in Honduras. This section focuses on their harrowing escape from the natives, and their struggle to survive the elements and their own exhaustion. The author uses vivid language to paint a picture of the men's desperation as they travel downstream. The constant threat of attack from the natives adds suspense to the journey, keeping the reader on edge as they make their way through uncharted waters. The men are weary and starving with only a few supplies left. The rising river and strong currents make their journey even more challenging. The author effectively builds tension as the men face exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless pursuit of the natives. One day during the journey, the Spaniards encounter a massive wall of rock that stretches across the river, blocking their path forward. The rock wall extends so far that they cannot go around it. The only option is to go over it. Estevanico and the others maneuver their boats and begin paddling against the current to try to get enough momentum to go over the wall. The men work tirelessly, beating their boats against the rocks, until they finally reach the top. Exhausted but relieved, they survey the area around them and realize that they are in a vast valley surrounded by high walls on all sides. The river below them is narrow and deep, making it difficult to climb back up. Just when they think they may have escaped the danger, a loud roar echoes through the valley. A powerful waterfall thunders down from above, crashing into the river below. Trapped and with nowhere else to go, the men prepare themselves for the worst. Estevanico looks up and sees water cascading down from the top of the cliff, forming a wall of white foam that fills the narrow part of the river. The water crashes into the river below, creating a deafening roar. Estevanico recognizes the danger and quickly directs the men to move away from the edge. As the water temperature rises, they jump into their boats and paddle away from the falls. The water is warm and the falls do not seem to slow down. Realizing that they cannot outrun the torrent, they turn their boats and attempt to go under the falls. The water temperature suddenly drops, signaling the end of their journey. The river has become wild, resembling the raging sea. And then suddenly, the men spot land and make a mad dash for it. After paddling furiously, they finally reach a small sandy beach and drag their boats onto land. Exhausted but relieved, they collapse on the ground, thankful to be alive. When they recover, they notice that they have landed on an island. The men are overjoyed and celebrate their survival by dancing and singing. However, they soon realize that they are in danger as they hear the sound of drums and shouts in the distance. The men quickly hide their boats and prepare to defend themselves against the natives. Estevanico continues to search for a way out of the island, hoping to find a cave or other shelter where they can hide. He discovers a cave near the shore, just big enough for a man to fit in. The entrance is concealed by bushes and thick vines, making it difficult to see. As darkness falls, he and the others take turns staying awake to watch for any approaching natives. One night, they hear the sound of footsteps near the cave and one of the men fires his gun, scaring off the intruder. The next morning, they find footprints leading away from the cave, indicating that the natives have retreated. The men decide to stay in the cave for another night to rest and gather their strength. In the morning, they leave the cave and discover more footprints leading away from the island. Relieved to have survived the night, the men decide to venture further inland in search of fresh water. They come across a large tree with low branches and decide to rest. Suddenly, 2 horsemen appear and tell the Spaniards that they are on an island and have been there for 3 days. The horsemen offer the Spaniards food and water and explain that they have come to rescue them. They lead the men back to their boats and help them repair the damage caused by the waterfall. The next morning, they set sail and head toward the open sea. After 5 days of sailing, they spot land and make their way to a small island. There they meet some natives who offer them food and water. After resting, they continue their journey and eventually reach the port of a Spanish settlement in Mexico. It is 1543 and over 600 men set sail from Spain, determined to conquer new lands and claim them for the Spanish crown. Led by experienced conquistadors, they brave the unknown, seeking adventure and riches beyond their wildest dreams. But fate had other plans for them. Through battles with hostile natives, betrayal, starvation, and the unforgiving terrain, their numbers dwindled, leaving only a handful of survivors to tell the tale. Estevanico, a young conquistador, finds himself among the lucky few who managed to stay alive throughout the treacherous journey. Now, after enduring months of hardship and battling against all odds, the survivors finally catch sight of land on the horizon. Hope surges through their weary bodies as they believe they have reached the end of their journey. But upon closer inspection, they realize that their troubles are far from over. As the survivors step foot on the shores of this new land, they are met with a sight that both entices and terrifies them. Before them lies a beautiful valley, seemingly untouched by the outside world. Lush vegetation stretches as far as the eye can see, promising the weary travelers the respite they desperately need. Yet there is something about this idyllic setting that sets off alarm bells in their minds. They sense danger lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect paradise. With caution, they begin to explore their surroundings, searching for signs of life or any indication of the safety of this place. As they venture deeper into the valley, they hear the distant sound of drums echoing through the trees. The rhythmic beat sends shivers down their spines, reminding them of the countless dangers they have faced at the hands of the natives in the unexplored territories. Fear and uncertainty grip them as they realize that they are not alone in this uncharted wilderness. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting long shadows across the valley, the survivors stumble upon a clearing. There, to their astonishment, they find a small settlement of huts made from materials they have not seen before. The structures are adorned with intricate designs and symbols that hint at a culture vastly different from their own. Intrigue and curiosity battle with their ingrained fear of the unknown as they consider approaching the settlement or finding shelter elsewhere for the night. Estevanico, torn between the need for rest and the fear of encountering hostile natives, struggles to make a decision. The safety of the group depends on their next move, and the stakes have never been higher. Will they risk it all and seek refuge in the settlement, or will they choose to remain vigilant and keep moving through the darkness? As night falls and the sounds of the jungle intensify, the survivors must decide whether to trust their instincts and confront the uncertainties of the settlement, or to brave the perils of the night and continue their journey into the unknown. With over 600 men embarking on the journey, only a fraction of them would ultimately survive the perilous expedition. The relentless pursuit of fortune and glory had led them to unimaginable hardships, testing their endurance, courage, and resolve. Through it all, Estevanico's story stands out as a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity in the face of adversity. His journey serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the unquenchable thirst for exploration and discovery that drives us to push beyond the boundaries of the known world. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. God bless. Alright, it's time for one last look at De Soto's journey. And yes, I am aware that we are in fact skipping over chapter 12, but this is a special bonus chapter because I have to admit there is more to this story than just what happened during the expedition itself. So we're going to spend some time today looking at how De Soto's journey changed the world. So here's the question for you guys. What did De Soto gain or achieve with his journey? Well, let me tell you, he learned a lot about the geography of the Southeast. He was the first European to see the Mississippi River in its mouth, which was pretty cool, I guess. But let's be honest, that's pretty much it when it comes to the things he actually accomplished. What about what he lost? Thousands upon thousands of native lives were lost thanks to De Soto and his men. Not only did they kill many natives on direct engagements, but also unintentionally through the introduction of new diseases. Spanish prestige was also lost, if not destroyed in the region. They found no gold or silver to bring back to Spain, and they established no colonies for Spain in North America. In fact, the only material goods that the expedition brought back to Spain were 2 Native American girls who had been taken captive, and also one survivor of the original 2,000 men, who set out from Cuba returned to Spain with the conquistadors. But honestly, one guy out of 2,000 isn't really that impressive. In fact, the people who lost the most from this expedition were probably the native peoples of the Southeast, as we already mentioned. They lost their lives, their land, and their way of life forever. The impact of this expedition would continue long after the conquistadors had moved on from the region. The tribes that survived the initial onslaught of disease would eventually be removed from their homelands by the US government in the early to mid-1800s, and by the end of the century, most of the tribes would cease to exist as independent nations. But this wasn't all due to De Soto. There were many other factors at play here, including the French and Indian War, where many of these same tribes sided with the French against the British. And then there was the American Revolution, where many of these same tribes sided with the Americans against the British. And then the United States did invade and remove them later. But it's important to remember that the conquistadors' arrival did kickstart the process of colonization in the Southeast, and that would eventually lead to the removal of these tribes. So in a way, De Soto did play a role in their demise, even though he didn't directly cause it. But again, it's important to remember that there were other factors at play here. It wasn't all because of De Soto. The reason why I keep emphasizing this is because this story has often been told as if De Soto is solely responsible for everything bad that happened to Native Americans after his arrival, and I want to make sure that doesn't happen. De Soto didn't single-handedly destroy these societies, nor did he do all the killing. He was just one factor among many others that contributed to their decline. Now, this doesn't excuse what De Soto and the conquistadors did, but it does help us better understand the situation. And speaking of things that De Soto did, let's talk about how his journey shaped future exploration. Despite losing so much in the New World, Spain wasn't deterred from exploring further. In fact, the Spanish crown would go on to fund over 100 expeditions into the area following De Soto's journey. The reason why is simple. They knew there was money to be made here, even if De Soto didn't find any. In the years following De Soto's journey, Spain would successfully establish colonies in Florida and the Southwest. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. For decades, Spain would struggle to maintain their colonies in Florida. In fact, they would abandon and then re-establish the colony of Pensacola several times before it finally took hold. You can actually still visit the fort that they built there today. I went there myself when I was a kid and it's pretty cool. And yeah, maybe De Soto wouldn't have explored as far west as he did if he hadn't gotten sick and gone crazy towards the end of his journey. This seems obvious since, if he hadn't gone insane, he wouldn't have died and therefore could have continued exploring. However, this is a bit of an alternate history hot tip. When writing about the conquistadors, especially Hernando de Soto, it's important to mention that their behavior wasn't always rational. Things like gold, God and glory motivated them, not always rationality and common sense. However, what happens next is something that most people don't realize De Soto had a hand in. Now, I know I'm supposed to be talking about the legacy of De Soto's expedition, but can I just say for a second how amazing it is that we are able to track and trace this stuff back to the actual sources. Like I can go online right now and pull up the original journals of conquistadors like De Soto and Cabeza de Vaca, or even earlier explorers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo. It is absolutely mind-blowing to think about how lucky we are to have these accounts of exploration and conquest from the very people who were there experiencing it. When you read an account of De Soto's journey from someone like Garhi Hernandez de Quiros, you get to see the events of the journey from the perspective of a lowly soldier in the ranks. When you read the account from Francisco de Barcia, you get to see it from the perspective of a man who escaped the expedition and spent years trying to find a way back to civilization. These first-hand accounts are what allow us to truly understand what happened during De Soto's journey. One of the reasons why so many people have heard of De Soto's journey today is because of what happened next. In the years following De Soto's death, rumors began to spread throughout Europe about the riches of the interior of North America. Stories of gold and silver circulated through Spain, and soon enough, the Spanish crown was flooded with requests from conquistadors wanting to explore the interior of the continent and find those riches. But it wasn't just Spain who heard these rumors. The Portuguese, the English, and the French all got wind of the riches of the New World. And that would lead to more exploration by all of these countries in the following decades. What started with De Soto's journey would lead to centuries of exploration and colonization in the Americas. Now, you might be wondering why I've skipped over chapter 12. Well, the reason why is because it's all about the incredible maps that were made during this time period, and I just couldn't fit it all into this video. We cover maps by Alonso de Santa Cruz, Alonso de Chaves, and an anonymous Italian cartographer. And trust me, if you like maps and exploration, it's an absolute must-read. De Soto's journey was one of the most significant events in the history of the Americas. It marked the beginning of the end for many Native American tribes, and it kicked off centuries of exploration and colonization in the region. However, it wasn't all bad. As we've seen, the journey had a profound impact on the way Europeans viewed the world. It opened up new possibilities for trade and exploration, and it led to the discovery of new lands and resources. Ultimately, the legacy of De Soto's journey is a complex one. It's a story of exploration and conquest, of great discoveries and terrible atrocities. But it's also a story of cultural exchange and the collision of two different worlds. As we continue to learn more about the journey and its aftermath, we gain a deeper understanding of the history of the Americas and our place in it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave any comments or questions you have down below. If you haven't already subscribed, please do, and I'll see you next time. Okay, so chapter 14 is all about the land and people they encountered when they got to the Americas. And it's pretty easy to summarize this chapter, because there's really two parts to it. It's one, well, what the Native Americans were like before European contact, and then two, how European contact affected Native Americans. So let's get to it. So the first part of the chapter discusses the Native American societies that Europeans would encounter, which is where we pick up our story last. In the previous chapter, we left off with the Mississippian mound builders. Now, to be fair, this isn't the only culture that will be discussed in this section, but it's definitely the most significant. You guys know why? Because there's like 5 of these big cities, right? So that's important. Okay, cool. Well, what else do we need to know about them? Well, for one thing, mound builders is actually an inaccurate term because while building mounds was a common practice, not all Mississippian societies did it. Not every mound builder was Mississippian, if that makes sense. Another thing to know is that they weren't unified. They weren't some big confederation. These were independent chiefdoms, hundreds of them across the Mississippi River Valley, each with its own chief. However, they were similar in a lot of ways. For one, they had a very structured society with the chief at the top and then artisans and then commoners and then slaves at the bottom. But their economy was also based on agriculture, maize in particular, and they all shared a common religion centered around the sun, and they believed that their chiefs were the link between them and the sun god. Also, like other Native American cultures, women played an important role in society, even if they didn't always have political power. Also, don't forget that the Mississippians were part of a larger network of trade. I mean, look at this map. There are so many different cultures and groups all interacting with each other through trade. The Mississippians had a robust trade network extending from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and they were trading lots of stuff, especially their prized possession, the copper axe. Like, look at this. We even made it into the textbook. Boom. So yeah, they were big-time baddies. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff to know about them, but it's honestly not enough. I mean, I could talk about them for like 5 videos, easily. But before I can do that, we got to move on and talk about how European contact impacted all of this. Well, when Europeans arrived, they brought with them 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: disease, warfare, alcohol, and women. Okay, just kidding. Only 3. Okay, those are the 3 worst things. But really, the deadliest thing they brought was disease. Like they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, they were coming from a completely different world, right? They thought they were the center of the universe and everyone else was a barbarian. so they didn't really understand the customs or culture of the Native Americans. But since they were so convinced of their own superiority, they were quick to judge and conquer. And I mean, look at this quote from Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was talking about the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. He said, "The filth and stench was so great that a Christian could not endure to stay in the town, so they just saw everything about Native American culture as disgusting. They hated their religion, their way of life, their art. They wanted to destroy it all, and unfortunately, they were successful. I mean, by 1600, the population of the Americas had dropped from 50 million to about 6 million. That's a 90% decline in population due to European diseases. But disease wasn't the only way that Europeans negatively affected Native Americans. They also had warfare. I mean, just look at this map. Like, there's so much red. Every time Europeans showed up on the shores of the Americas, they had one goal in mind: find gold and conquer. I mean, this is the Spanish, the French, the English, the Dutch. They all had the same goal, and they did whatever they had to do to achieve it, which meant killing tons of Native Americans. And it's not like the Native Americans didn't fight back. I mean, check out this battle between the Apaches and the Spanish. Boom. That's a good-looking firefight. But despite all their efforts, the Europeans proved too strong. The conquistadors had horses and steel weapons and guns, and that made all the difference. And finally, the third way that Europeans hurt Native Americans was through social disruption. I mean, think about it. All these years, the Mississippians and other Native Americans had been living in relative peace, trading with each other, forming alliances. And then boom, Europeans show up and they're just destroying everyone. So the social disruption caused by Europeans led to a lot of fighting among Native Americans, which only weakened them further against the Europeans. Okay, so now we have to contrast that with the Spanish experience. Like I've mentioned in earlier videos, the Spanish came into the Americas with one goal in mind: find gold and conquer. Everything else was secondary. They didn't care about learning the Native American languages. They didn't care about understanding their customs. They just wanted to conquer them and take their land. And that's unfortunate, because the cultures they encountered were beautiful. They were complex and vibrant. I mean, here's what Cortés wrote about the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. It was one of the finest cities in the world. Its buildings were fine and large, and its towers and temples magnificent. And he's not the only one who thought this. I mean, look at this painting. Isn't it beautiful? Look at the detail, the color, the emotion captured in each brushstroke. This was painted by a European who witnessed these cultures firsthand, and he was awestruck by what he saw. So clearly, these cultures were beautiful and impressive. I mean, the Spanish encountered huge cities, complex societies, and trade networks, stretching from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, but they didn't care. They couldn't see past the fact that these cultures weren't Christian, that they didn't speak Spanish, that they didn't look or behave like the Spanish. All they saw were barbarians who needed to be conquered, and that's such a shame, because if they had taken the time to understand these cultures, maybe they could have learned something new. Maybe they could have formed alliances. Maybe they could have lived in harmony. But they didn't. Instead, they brought disease and death and destruction wherever they went. Okay, click right over here to grab a view packet if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And additionally, if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe and I shall oblige. In our last chapter, we got word that Lewis and Clark had finally made it back to St. Louis with their grizzly bear and all. Of the knowledge that they had gathered about the Louisiana Purchase, but what about the people whose lands they had passed through? What happened to Sacagawea and the Shoshone people after the explorers had moved on? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's go back to the journal and see how it ends. August 23rd, 1806, somewhere along the Missouri River. Today is the last day of the journey. The notes from here until the end are short, sparse, not nearly as detailed as everything that came before. It's like the further away they get from the Pacific, the less interesting things become for Clark. At least he didn't have to worry about getting pregnant anymore. But Lewis was still busy recording the temperature, the weather, the spirits of the people around them, and even stopping to pick up arrowheads along the riverbanks, because why not? They had nothing better to do. They were waiting for a canoe to take them further up the Missouri, but in the meantime, they did some fishing. And then when the canoe arrived, they loaded up and set off towards the mouth of the Yellowstone River, where they hoped to find Lewis and Clark again. Now, if you remember, Clark was much more interested in finding a route to the Pacific than he was in coming back this way. But here they were, so obviously, someone talked him into it. Probably some kind of government conspiracy. It took 6 days to travel from the mouth of the Yellowstone to the mouth of the White River, the Great Sioux Nation country. This part of the river was more traveled than most, so they met lots of new people, including more traders who had come from St. Louis and some Native Americans who were heading the other way. And on September, finally, they found Lewis and 2 other men, who had been sent to find them at last. They all embraced and told stories about the past 2 years, about the wonders that they had seen and the horrors that they had survived. After a few days of rest, the whole group set sail up the Missouri, passing by more indigenous villages and trading posts. Eventually, the river became too shallow for their canoes, so they switched to horses and started riding overland. They crossed paths with several more groups of natives over the next few weeks and finally reached the Kansas River on October there. They left their horses and took to the water again, traveling by canoe down to the Missouri and eventually to the Mississippi. The first snow of winter fell on December, and they spent Christmas camped out near the Mississippi eating dried meat and berries. By January 1807, they were back in St. Louis, having traveled over 9,000 miles since May of 1804. Their expedition was complete. Now, while Lewis and Clark got all of the attention when they returned, the others didn't do much to keep a low profile. They filed their reports and waited for instructions from Jefferson, but in February they got word that the president wanted them to go out west again and explore the Columbia River. No thanks, guys. They said they had done enough exploring for a lifetime and refused. And maybe that was an exaggeration. Maybe they would have gone if the president had asked them to, but he never did. Instead, he sent another group out to explore the Columbia in 1808, which might be why Lewis's journal ends here. His big adventure was over. He had done his duty. Now he could sit back and enjoy the peace and quiet, or maybe just go to sleep. It's hard to say, because according to the accounts of those who knew him, Lewis was a bit of a mess after the journey. He suffered from bouts of depression, bouts of anger, bouts of energy. He had nightmares about the voyage and couldn't sleep, and the worst part was that nobody knew how to help him. Back then, mental health wasn't really a thing. They didn't know what to make of a man who seemed to be losing his mind, but there's a good chance that's what was happening. 2 years spent on the road will do that to a person. All of the sights and sounds and smells of home start to fade away. And no matter how hard you try, your mind can never truly settle down. And that's certainly true for Lewis, but also for the places that they visited, the people they met and the animals they saw. Think about the grizzlies. We don't know exactly what they looked like. We only know what Lewis and Clark reported seeing. And think about the Shoshone. They had a culture, traditions, a way of life that existed long before Lewis and Clark ever showed up. And yet that's not what history remembers. History remembers Lewis and Clark. Even though the United States bought the land from France, it wasn't empty. People lived there. They hunted there. They had families there. They had friends there. And now they were gone. The land was theirs. And we don't know where any of them went, what happened to them, or what they thought about the explorers who had come through their territory. We do know that Sacagawea didn't get to finish raising her son Jean-Baptiste because she died in childbirth shortly after he was born. But other than that, well, we don't know. We're listening to the story of Lewis and Clark, sure, that's the title of this series. But who else is there who has a story to tell? Whose perspective should we hear? Because this is the end of the journal. It's the final entry, and it's kind of anticlimactic, isn't it? Nothing really happens. They're just traveling from place to place, meeting new people every few days, and then moving on. It makes sense though. They had to get home somehow, right? And the journey took time. It took time for the rivers to carry them upstream, for the horses to carry them overland, and for the snows to melt and the ice to break in the spring. But we're not here for the practicality of it. We're here for the wonder. We want to hear about the amazing sights and the wondrous wildlife and the magical Native American tribes. But we've heard all of that before. We've read the journals of Lewis and Clark many times, and we know the story that they're telling. What we haven't heard is the story of the people that they met along the way, the story of the ones that stayed behind, the story of the ones that died. Think about the thousands of people who probably stood on the banks of the river and watched those explorers pass by. They probably wondered who they were and where they came from. Maybe they traded with them, maybe they fought with them, maybe they welcomed them, maybe they feared them. But whatever their reaction, they went back to their normal lives. They fished in the river, hunted in the forest, picked berries on the plains, and year after year, the travelers from the east became a distant memory, an echo along the riverbank. But we remember them. We remember Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. We remember all of the names that history chose to remember. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it's enough that we remember them. Maybe it's enough that we remember the journey, the hardships they endured, the discoveries they made, and the legacy that they left behind. Or maybe it's not enough and we need to listen a little closer to the whispers of the wind through the tall grass, to the murmur of the river flowing to the sea, to the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead, because those are the voices that have been here the longest and they have the most to say. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, please hit like, leave a comment and subscribe for more content. See you next time.